Please don't harm me. I'm not a criminal.
My brothers and I know you are trying to escape your toxic husband. We will help you. We will protect you and then worship you like he never did.
Alina hit the pavement before she even realized she had been thrown. The rain in Seoul was cold, but the blood blooming across her white maternity top was warmer, a terrifying contrast that made her stomach twist in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. She scrambled backward on her elbows, the gravel digging into her palms, as the heavy oak door of the penthouse swung open again. "Get up, Alina." His voice was a low, dangerous velvet. It was the voice that had once whispered promises in her ear, the same one that now signaled another broken rib. She didn't look up. She knew if she looked at him, she would see the man she had moved across the world for, the one who had promised her that a black woman from Lagos would be a queen in his kingdom. Instead, she was a prisoner in a glass tower. "I can't," she gasped, clutching her stomach. A sharp, searing pain radiated through her pelvis. "The baby, something is wrong." He laughed, a dry, jagged sound that cut through the thunder. "You're always making excuses. You think that's going to save you from being a pathetic, useless wife." He stepped into the light, his expensive leather shoes stopping inches from her face. Without warning, his foot connected with her side. The world went white. Alina didn't scream. The air had been stolen from her lungs. She felt the warmth between her thighs turn into a flood. As she curled into a ball on the wet concrete, her husband simply turned around and walked back inside, clicking the lock shut. Hours or minutes could have passed before she found the strength to crawl. She reached the street, her vision blurring, and flagged down a taxi that nearly hit her. The driver looked at the blood and the bruises and didn't ask questions. He just drove. The hospital was a haze of fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic. Alina lay on the gurney, watching the ceiling tiles rush past. She kept telling the doctors about the movement she hadn't felt in hours. When the female physician finally looked at her with pity, Alina knew. "I'm sorry," the doctor whispered. "The trauma was too great. We have to take you into surgery." When Alina woke up, she was empty. The silence in her womb was the loudest thing she had ever heard. She stared at the Ford drip, her heart hardening into a cold, jagged stone. He had taken her family, her dignity, and now he had killed the only part of her that was still pure. She wouldn't wait for him to come to the hospital. "You're bleeding," he said. His Korean was formal, but his tone held a strange, vibrating frequency of anger, not at her, but for her. "She has the mark of a coward on her face," the one to the left remarked, his eyes fixed on the darkening bruise on her jaw. The third brother remained silent, but he stepped closer, his presence a wall of heat against the cold night. He looked at her tattered hospital wristband and the blood staining her coat. Without a word, he reached down and scooped her into his arms. Alina struggled feebly. "Put me down. You don't understand. My husband, he's powerful. He'll kill you." The man holding her looked down at her, a small, predatory smile tugging at his lips. "He can try, but we are the Beck brothers. And you, little bird, are no longer his concern." They carried her to a black sedan that looked like a tank disguised as a luxury vehicle. The interior smelled of expensive tobacco and sandalwood. They sat her in the middle of the back seat, flanking her like two massive, silent guardians, while the third drove with a terrifying, calm speed. "Where are you taking me?" Alina asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "To a place where the world can't find you," the one on her right said. He took her hand, his fingers tracing the wedding ring that felt like a shackle. He didn't pull it off. He just looked at it as if he were memorizing its shape so he could melt it down later. They arrived at a secluded estate hidden behind high stone walls and iron gates. Inside, the house was a masterpiece of minimalist design and ancient power. They didn't call a maid. They didn't call a nurse. The brothers moved with a synchronized purpose. The one who had carried her, Juan, sat her on a velvet sofa. The oldest, Daeshim, knelt before her with a medical kit, while the youngest, Miho, stood by the window, his phone to his ear, his voice a low hiss as he gave orders to erase any trace of a woman leaving the hospital. "This will sting," Daeshim said, cleaning the cuts on her face. He was meticulous, his touch surprisingly light. He didn't look at her with the lust she was used to from men in power. He looked at her with a terrifyingly focused possessiveness. "Why are you doing this?" Alina asked, her voice trembling. "You don't even know me." Dacian paused, his eyes meeting hers. They were dark, like the bottom of a well. "We know enough. We know you were running. We know you have been broken. And we know that we don't like other people breaking things that belong in our city." "I don't belong to anyone," she snapped, a spark of her old self flickering in her eyes. Miho turned from the window, a smirk playing on his lips. "Not yet. But the night is young, Alina." For the next 3 days, they kept her in a suite that felt more like a sanctuary than a prison. They brought her food she couldn't name, but that tasted like comfort. They brought her silk robes that didn't chafe her healing skin. But most importantly, they brought her silence. On the 4th night, the fever broke. Alina sat up in bed, the moonlight spilling across the floor. She heard the door creak open. All 3 of them walked in. They didn't say a word as they sat on the edge of the large bed, surrounding her. "The man you married," Juan began, his voice dropping an octave. "He has been looking for you. He thinks he can buy his way back into your life." Alina felt the familiar cold dread wash over her. "He'll find me. He always finds me." Miho leaned in, his face inches from hers. The scent of him was intoxicating, a mix of rain and something primal. "He won't find a trace of you. To the world, Alina is a ghost. To us, you are the only thing that matters." "You're dangerous," she whispered, her eyes darting between them. "I've seen men like you." "You've seen men who pretend to be powerful by hurting those smaller than them," Dacian corrected, reaching out to tuck a lock of her hair behind her ear. "We are powerful because we destroy anyone who dares to touch what is ours. And Alina, we have decided." "Decided what?" "That he has to hold over you no more," the brothers whispered in a haunting unison that vibrated through the very mattress. Juan leaned forward, his hand resting on the small of her back, the heat of his palm seeping through the silk. "You are ours to protect, love, and—" He paused, his eyes darkening with a hunger that made her breath hitch claim. The intensity in the room shifted. It wasn't the fear she had felt with her husband. This was something different, a heavy, magnetic pull that demanded her surrender. They weren't asking, they were stating a fact of the universe. "I've just lost everything," she cried, the grief finally breaking through her armor. "My baby, my life. I'm empty." "Then we will fill that emptiness," Miho said, his voice a growl. He climbed onto the bed, pulling her back against his chest. He was a solid wall of muscle, a fortress that felt like it could withstand a hurricane. Dacian took her feet in his lap, massaging the tension away with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Juan stayed in front of her, his gaze locked on her lips. "He will come for me," she warned, even as she leaned into Miho's warmth. "Let him come," Juan whispered, leaning in until their noses brushed. "We have the papers ready. Not just for your freedom, but for his ending. But tonight, you don't think about him. You only think about the 3 men who are going to show you what it actually feels like to be worshipped." He pressed his lips to her forehead, a soft, lingering kiss that felt like a seal on a contract. Alina closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was falling. She felt like she had finally been caught. The weeks that followed were a blur of recovery and quiet observation. Alina moved through the marble halls of the estate like a ghost returning to life, her body finally knitting itself back together. The surgical scars had faded into thin, silver lines, and the hollow ache in her spirit was being replaced by a strange, budding curiosity. While all 3 brothers were constant shadows in her life, it was Dacian who became her anchor. He was the eldest, the one with the quietest voice and the steadiest hands. He didn't demand her attention, he simply waited for her to offer it. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the garden in shades of gold, Alina found him in the library. She stood in the doorway, watching him navigate a stack of legal documents with a focused frown. "Dacian," she ventured, her voice barely a whisper. He looked up, and the hardness in his eyes melted instantly. "You should be resting, Alina." "I'm tired of resting," she said, stepping into the room. She felt a sudden, sharp need for the specific safety he provided. "The others. Juan and Miho, they are so intense. It's a lot. Can I just stay with you today? Just you." A flicker of something complex crossed his face, a mixture of triumph and deep, protective warmth. If that is what you want, that is how it will be. He stood up and held out his hand. When she took it, his grip was firm, grounding her. That night, the atmosphere in the house shifted. Juan and Miho stayed downstairs, respecting the boundary she had drawn, leaving the upper floor to the heavy, expectant silence between Alina and Daesham. He led her to his private quarters, a room that smelled of cedar and the cold, crisp air of the mountains. He didn't turn on the overhead lights, opting instead for a few low lamps that cast long, amber shadows across the silk sheets of his bed. Alina stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. She felt the ghost of her husband's hands on her skin, the memory of pain, of being gripped too hard, of being used as a punching bag for his frustrations. She flinched as a pair of hands settled on her shoulders, but the touch was different. Daesham's palms were broad and warm, and he didn't squeeze. He simply held her. "He isn't here, Alina," Daesham whispered into her hair. "In this room, his name doesn't exist. Your past doesn't exist. There is only the breath in your lungs and the man holding you." She turned in his arms, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked up at him, searching his dark eyes for a sign of the cruelty she had come to expect from men. She found only a bottomless, hungry devotion. "Make me forget," she choked out, her fingers tangling in the fine fabric of his shirt. "I don't want to remember anything but you." Daesham didn't hesitate. He leaned down, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was slow, deep, and devastatingly thorough. It wasn't an assault, it was an invitation. He tasted of expensive whiskey and something dark and primal. Alina moaned into his mouth, her hands sliding up to cup his face, her thumbs tracing the sharp line of his jaw. He lifted her effortlessly, her legs wrapping around his waist as he carried her the short distance to the bed. He laid her down on the silk, his body following hers, pinning her with a weight that felt like a shield rather than a burden. His hands began to wander, tracing the curves of her body with a reverence that made her skin tingle. He moved slowly, peeling away her robe, his eyes devouring every inch of her healed skin as if she were a masterpiece he had waited a lifetime to behold. When he finally moved between her thighs, Alina gasped, her head falling back against the pillows. His touch was electric. He found the sensitive spots her husband had ignored for years, his tongue and fingers working in a deliberate, agonizingly sweet harmony. He watched her face, his expression one of intense focus, as if her pleasure were the only mission he had ever been assigned. "You are so beautiful," he groaned against her skin, his breath hot and ragged. "Every part of you belongs to me tonight. Do you understand?" "Only me." As he entered her, a slow and powerful surge that filled the emptiness she had carried for so long, Alina's eyes flew open. The sensation was overwhelming and intense, searing connection that wiped away every jagged memory of the hospital, the blood, and the man who had discarded her. Daesham moved with a rhythmic, pounding grace, his muscles rippling under her touch. He wasn't just taking her, he was reclaiming her. The lovemaking was fierce and unapologetic. Every thrust was a promise, every touch a vow. Daesham's hands were everywhere, pulling her closer, anchoring her to the present. Alina cried out, her voice echoing in the quiet room, a sound of release and raw, unfiltered passion. She arched her back, her fingers digging into his shoulders as the world narrowed down to the friction of their bodies and the heat of their breath. In the height of her climax, as waves of pure, golden sensation crashed over her, the face of her husband finally dissolved into nothingness. The fear that had lived in her marrow for years simply evaporated, replaced by the heavy, satisfying reality of the man above her. Daesham collapsed against her, his heart beating a frantic echo to her own, his face buried in the crook of her neck. "You're mine," he rasped, his voice thick with the aftermath of his own release. "Don't you ever forget it. I will kill anyone who tries to take this away from us." Alina lay there, wrapped in his arms, the cool silk of the sheets a contrast to the fire still burning in her veins. For the first time since she had arrived in Korea, the nightmares were silent. She was no longer a victim or a runaway. She was a woman held by a king, and the shadows of her old life had no power in the light of his fire. Morning came quickly. For the first time in years, Alina slept without the sudden jolt of a nightmare. Beside her, Daesham watched her breathe, his heart feeling a strange, heavy tug he had never experienced before. He moved carefully, sliding out of the bed so as not to disturb her rest. He wanted to bring her something warm, a gesture of care to ground her in this new reality before the world rushed back in. He pulled on a silk robe and made his way down the grand staircase toward the kitchen. The house was silent, save for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of the city awakening. However, as he entered the kitchen, he found he wasn't alone. Juan and Miho were already there, leaning against the marble island with expressions that could have chilled the morning air to ice. Miho was gripping a mug of black coffee so tightly his knuckles were white. Juan didn't even have a drink. He was simply staring at the doorway, his eyes dark with a simmering, dangerous jealousy. The tea is for her, I assume? Juan's voice was like a low growl of thunder. Daesham reached for a ceramic pot, his movements steady despite the tension. She needs to stay hydrated. She's still recovering. Is that what we're calling it now? Miho snapped, stepping forward into the light. The usual playful smirk was gone, replaced by a raw, jagged edge of anger. We all stood in that rain, Daesham. We all carried her into this house. We agreed she was ours. Not yours. Ours. Daesham paused, the steam from the kettle rising between them. He looked at his brothers, seeing his own reflection in their identical faces, fueled by the same primal possessiveness. She asked to be with me. She was scared. I didn't plan for it to go that far, but she needed to feel something other than the pain that bastard left her with. And you just couldn't help yourself, Juan muttered, his jaw tight. You took the first bite of the prize we all worked for. The air in the kitchen was thick with the threat of violence, a rare occurrence between the triplets. They were a single unit, a three-headed dragon that moved in perfect synchronization, but Alina had become the one thing they couldn't easily share. I apologize, Daesham said, his voice dropping into a formal, somber tone. I let my own hunger override the pact. It won't happen again. We move as one from here on out. Juan reached out, his hand closing over the handle of the teapot before Daesham could lift it. Then let me take it to her. You've had your time in the sun, brother. Let her see a different side of the family this morning. Daesham hesitated. He knew exactly what Juan was planning. Juan was the most aggressive of the three, the one who moved with a predatory grace that usually left women breathless and terrified. But he had made a mistake, and he owed his brothers the chance to re-establish the balance. He stepped back, letting go of the pot. Fine, Daesham whispered. But be gentle. She is still fragile. Juan let out a short, sharp laugh as he arranged a tray. I know exactly how to handle her. Upstairs, Alina was beginning to stir. The bed felt vast and empty without Daesham's heat, and a small, lingering fear tried to creep back into her mind. She sat up, pushing her hair back, when the door opened. It wasn't Daesham. Juan walked in, wearing nothing but a white towel slung low on his hips, his broad, tattooed chest glistening as if he had just stepped out of a cold shower. He carried the tray with a casual, practiced ease. Morning, little bird, Juan said, his voice a rich, vibrating baritone that seemed to hum in the very air of the room. Alina clutched the sheets to her chest, her eyes wide. Juan? Where is Daesham? Busy, Juan lied easily, setting the tray down on the nightstand. He sat on the edge of the bed, much closer than a stranger should. The scent of him, sea salt, expensive soap, and pure masculinity hit her like a wave. I thought you might prefer some company that isn't quite so serious. He poured a cup of the herbal tea, but he didn't hand it to her. Instead, he took a sip himself, his dark eyes locked onto hers over the rim of the cup. The silence in the room became heavy, charged with a sudden, electric tension. Alina found she couldn't look away. Juan didn't have Daesham's calm. He had a wild, untamed energy that made her blood run hot. You look different this morning, Juan remarked, his voice dropping to a whisper. He reached out, his fingers grazing the skin of her shoulder where the silk robe had slipped. More color in your cheeks. Daesham clearly worked hard to make you feel welcome. Alina blushed, a deep heat spreading through her chest. He was kind. Kind is boring, Juan murmured. He leaned closer, the heat radiating off his bare skin making her dizzy. I don't want to be kind to you, Alina. I want to make you scream. I want to make you forget you ever had a name before we found you." He moved with a sudden, fluid grace, setting the cup aside and leaning over her. As he moved, he intentionally let his hand brush the knot of his towel. With a slow, deliberate shrug of his hips, the fabric gave way. The towel slid to the floor in a soft heap of white cotton. Alina's breath hitched in her throat. He was magnificent, a statue of bronze and muscle, and as the towel fell, his heavy, thick rod dangled between his thighs, already hardening in the morning air. It was a blatant, arrogant display of power and desire. Her husband had always used sex as a tool of humiliation, something quick and cold that left her feeling used and discarded. But Juan was looking at her as if she were the most precious thing he had ever seen, even as his body signaled a raw, carnal intent. "Do you want me to leave, Alina?" he asked, his voice a low, teasing vibration. He knew the answer. He could see the way her pupils dilated, the way her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow gasps. "No," she whispered, the word escaping her before she could think. Juan didn't wait for a second invitation. He crawled onto the bed, his large hands framing her face as he crashed his lips against hers. This wasn't the slow, exploratory kiss of the night before. This was a claim. He tasted of the tea and a fierce, unyielding hunger. He stripped her robe away with one swift motion, his eyes devouring her. He moved between her thighs, his knees forcing her legs wide. He looked down at the junction of her body, his thumb tracing the soft folds that were already slick with her own arousal. "You're so wet for me," he groaned, a sound of pure, masculine triumph. "Did you think of me while my brother had his way with you?" Alina couldn't answer. She was drowning in the sensation of his skin against hers. When he pushed into her, it was a sudden, glorious invasion. He was larger than she expected, a thick, solid presence that stretched her to her limit. She gasped, her fingers digging into the muscles of his back, her head tossing back against the pillows. The morning sex was intense and rhythmic, a steady, pounding pace that demanded her full attention. Juan wasn't interested in being careful, he wanted to mark her. Every thrust felt like it was breaking down another brick in the wall she had built around her heart. He was relentless, his body moving with a powerful, primal force that made the bed frame groan. "Tell me," Juan rasped, his breath hot against her ear as he gripped her hips, pulling her harder against him. "Is this what he gave you? Did that coward ever make you feel like this?" "Never," she sobbed, the word a confession of years of misery. "Please, Juan, more." He obeyed, his movements becoming faster, deeper, until he was hitting the very back of her womb. The pleasure was so sharp it was almost painful, a white-hot light that burned away the last lingering shadows of her marriage. She felt the walls of her whole twitch and tighten around him, struggling to contain the sheer volume of him. As the climax took her, it was like an explosion of stars behind her eyelids. She screamed his name, her body convulsing in a violent, beautiful release that left her shaking. Juan followed her moments later, his body stiffening as he poured himself into her, a deep, guttural roar escaping his throat. He didn't pull away immediately. He stayed buried inside her, his forehead resting against hers, both of them gasping for air. The silence that followed was peaceful, a stark contrast to the storm that had just passed. Alina lay there, her heart slowing, feeling the weight of him as a comfort. The man she had married was a ghost, a paper tiger with no teeth. He had tried to break her, but in the hands of these brothers, she was being forged into something new. Juan finally pulled back, reaching down to stroke her damp hair. He looked at her with a satisfied, possessive smile. "Now you know, Alina. Dacia might be the soul of this house, but I am the fire. And Mijo, well, you'll find out soon enough what he is." He stood up, unabashed in his nakedness, and picked up the towel. "Drink your tea. We have a long day ahead of us. Your husband's lawyers tried to call this morning. They won't be calling again." Alina watched him walk out, her body feeling heavy and well-used in a way that made her feel alive. She reached for the tea, her hand finally steady, when the noise came, shattering the peace of the estate, and she recognized that voice. It was a jagged blade that had cut her for years. "Alina, get out here," her husband roared from the intercom speakers. "I know you're in there, you ungrateful bitch. I'm not signing anything. You're my wife. You belong to me." Daeshim, Juan, and Miho appeared in the hallway simultaneously, as if summoned by the scent of a threat. They didn't look worried, they looked bored, like lions watching a hyena yapping at the edge of their territory. "Stay here," Daeshim commanded, his voice cold and flat. "Watch from the window if you must, but do not step outside. This ends today." Alina hurried to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the driveway. Below, her husband, a man who once seemed like an invincible giant to her, looked small and pathetic. He was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, his face red with a raw tale of rage and desperation. When the three brothers stepped out onto the gravel, even he faltered for a second, seeing the triple threat of their looming silhouettes. "Where is she?" he spat, trying to regain his footing. "I've changed my mind. The divorce is off. I want my wife back. She's pregnant with my heir, and I'm taking her home." Miho stepped forward, a sharp, cruel smile playing on his lips. "The pregnancy you ended with your boots? Or the heir you left bleeding on a sidewalk?" The husband's face twisted. He looked up at the house, spotting Alina behind the glass. "There she is. Look at her, hiding behind 3 thugs. Tell me, Alina, how many of them did you have to fuck to get this protection? You've always been a cheap slut, haven't you? Crossing oceans just to spread your legs for whoever has a bigger bank account." The air seemed to vibrate with a sudden, lethal tension. Juan moved so fast it was a blur. He didn't punch the man. He simply grabbed him by the throat and lifted him until his toes scraped the gravel. "You chose the wrong day to speak," Juan hissed, his voice vibrating with a primal fury that made the husband's eyes bulge. "You think you're a man because you hit a woman? You're a parasite. And today, the host is dead." Daeshim stepped into the husband's blurred line of sight, holding a thick stack of papers. "This isn't just a divorce filing. This is a comprehensive record of your financial crimes, your offshore accounts, and the CCTV footage from your own penthouse that you thought you deleted. The footage of you throwing her out like trash. You can't do this," the man wheezed, clawing at Juan's iron grip. "We are the Beck family," Miho whispered, leaning into the man's ear. "We don't ask for permission. We create the law." With a nod from Daeshim, 2 black SUVs swerved into the driveway. Men in dark suits, the brothers' private security, stepped out. They didn't treat him like a businessman. They treated him like a piece of evidence. They cuffed his hands behind his back with a brutal efficiency that made him shriek. "You're going to a very specific prison," Daeshim said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "One that we own. You won't see a judge. You won't see a lawyer. You will only see the 4 walls of a cell until we decide you've paid for every bruise you put on her skin." "Alina, help me," the husband screamed as he was dragged toward the vehicle. "You're a Martinez. You're supposed to be." "She is nothing to you," Juan interrupted, kicking the car door shut on his cries. "She is ours now." Alina watched from the window as the cars peeled away, taking the source of her nightmares into a darkness from which he would never return. She leaned her forehead against the cool glass, a sob of pure, unadulterated relief breaking from her chest. The weight that had sat on her shoulders for 5 years, the fear of his footsteps, the sound of his key in the lock, simply vanished. When the brothers returned inside, they found her standing in the center of the foyer. She didn't look like the broken girl they had found in the rain. Her eyes were bright, her posture straight. She looked at them, the stoic Daeshim, the fiery Juan, and the clever Miho, and saw not just her saviors, but her home. She was grateful for the protection, yes. She was grateful for the way they had dismantled her enemy with the flick of a wrist. But she was also humming with the memory of the intense, world-shaking orgasms they had gifted her over the last 2 days. They had replaced his pain with a pleasure so deep it had rewired her soul. "Is it over?" she asked softly. "He will never breathe the same air as you again," Daeshim promised, walking over to cup her face. "I want to do something for you," Alina said, her hands covering his. "I want to cook. For all of you. A real meal. Back home, when we love someone, we feed them until they can't move." The brothers exchanged a look of surprised delight. In their world of cold business and blood, a home-cooked meal was a luxury they rarely tasted. "Then let us help you," Miho said, looping an arm around her waist. "We're excellent at following orders in the kitchen." The next few hours were the most peaceful Alina had ever known. She took over the sprawling professional kitchen, her hands moving with a confidence she thought she had lost. She prepared jollof rice, the spicy, rich aroma filling the house and clashing beautifully with the scent of the brothers' expensive cologne. She fried plantains until they were caramelized and sweet, and prepared a peppered chicken that made their eyes water just from the steam. The triplets hovered around her like giant, hungry shadows. Juan chopped onions with a lethal precision that made her laugh. Miho was tasked with tasting everything, his eyes lighting up with every spicy bite. Daeshim stood back, watching the scene with a rare, soft smile, his heart swelling as he realized that by saving this woman, they had somehow saved themselves from the coldness of their own lives. When the table was finally set, the feast was a vibrant explosion of color and heat. They sat together, the hierarchy of the bosses discarded for the simple joy of a shared meal. "This is incredible, Alina," Juan said, his mouth full of spicy rice. "If I knew you could cook like this, I would have kidnapped you months ago." "You did kidnap me," she teased, taking a sip of wine. "No," Miho corrected, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "We rescued a queen. And a queen deserves a kingdom." As they ate, the conversation flowed naturally, no talk of business, no talk of the husband, just stories of their childhood and her dreams for the future. Alina felt a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the pepper in the food. She looked at these three dangerous, powerful men and realized she wasn't just their claim. She was their heart. As the meal wound down, the air in the room shifted again, becoming thick with a different kind of hunger. The way they looked at her over their wine glasses told her that the thank you they really wanted wasn't just in the food. "You worked so hard on this lunch," Daeshim whispered, his voice a low vibration that made her thighs ache with a sudden memory of the night before. "I think it's time we showed you our appreciation." Alina smiled, her heart racing not with fear, but with anticipation. "I think I'd like that." "All of us, Alina?" Juan asked, his dark eyes challenging and devouring her at the same time. "The lunch was for all of us. The gratitude should be too." She didn't flinch. She stood up, reaching for Daeshim's hand with her left and Miho's with her right, while Juan stood behind her, his chest a solid wall against her back. "All of you," she breathed. "I am yours, after all. And I want you three on the bed with me," she added. The three brothers grinned happily, especially Miho because he was the only one who hadn't had a taste of her, but Daeshim was the first to move. He stepped into her personal space, his large, cool hands sliding up her neck to cradle her face. He looked at her with a steady, burning intensity that promised both ruin and salvation. "You fed us, Alina," he whispered, his thumb grazing her lower lip. "Now, it's our turn to feast." Without a word, Juan scooped her up, his muscles rippling under his thin shirt. He didn't carry her back to the bedroom. Instead, he laid her across the long, dark wood of the dining table, sweeping the expensive ceramic plates onto the floor with a reckless clatter that echoed through the house. The vibration of the impact sent a jolt of electricity straight to Alina's core. She was exposed, centered under the chandelier's glow, with three predators closing in. Miho was already at her feet. He didn't wait for permission. He reached up, his fingers hooking into the waistband of her silk trousers and pulling them down in one fluid motion. He didn't stop until she was completely bare to their eyes. The brothers stood in a triangle around her, their gazes traveling over her healed body with a hunger that was physical, almost tactile. "Claiming you isn't enough," Miho growled, his voice dropping into a register that made Alina's toes curl. "We want to consume you." He moved in first, his head disappearing between her thighs. When his tongue first made contact with her swollen, aching center, Alina arched her back so sharply her spine nearly left the table. The sensation was a lightning strike, hot, wet, and agonizingly precise. He knew exactly where to find her, his tongue flickering against her clitoris with a rhythmic, relentless pressure that made her breath catch in a jagged sob. At the same time, Juan moved to her side. He ripped his shirt open, buttons flying across the room, and leaned over her. He captured one of her front in his hand, his fingers squeezing the soft tissue before his mouth closed over her nipple. The contrast was overwhelming, the sharp, piercing heat of Miho between her legs and the heavy, tugging suction of Juan at her front. Alina's hands flew to their heads, her fingers tangling in their thick, dark hair as she tried to anchor herself to reality. Daeshim, she gasped, her eyes searching for the eldest. He was right there, looming over her head. He leaned down, his face inches from hers, his dark eyes reflecting her own desire back at her. Right here, Alina. I'm right here. He crashed his lips against hers, drowning out her moans with a deep, possessive kiss. He tasted of the dark wine they had shared and the promise of a future she was finally brave enough to want. His tongue danced with hers, a slow, sensual battle that mimicked the movement of his brothers below. Alina was being pulled in 3 different directions, her senses screaming at the overload. Miho's tongue was a masterpiece of torture. He moved with a predatory focus, his breath hot against her sensitive skin, his hands gripping her thighs to keep her open and vulnerable. He was eating her with a desperation that suggested he was starving, his suction increasing until Alina felt the first tremors of a climax beginning to build in the marrow of her bones. Above her, Juan shifted to her other front, his tongue swirling around the peak until it was a hard, sensitive point of fire. He moved his hand down, his palm flat against her stomach, feeling the way her muscles jumped and twitched under his touch. Every time Miho flicked his tongue, Juan's hand would press harder, grounding her as the pleasure threatened to spin her out of control. Please, Alina whined into Daeshim's mouth, her voice a broken, high-pitched sound. I can't. It's too much. Please don't stop. We're never stopping, Daeshim rasped against her lips, breaking the kiss just long enough to speak. You wanted the Beck brothers, Alina. You wanted the fire. Now, burn with us. The intensity escalated. Miho began to use his fingers, sliding 2 of them deep inside her while his mouth continued its relentless assault. The fullness was staggering. Alina's hips began to buck of their own accord, her heels drumming against the wood of the table. She was a woman possessed, her body no longer hers, but a vessel for the pleasure they were pouring into her. Juan's mouth left her front, traveling down the center of her torso, his teeth grazing her ribs, leaving small, stinging marks of ownership. He reached the junction where Miho was working, his large hand replacing Miho's as he prepared to enter her. Look at me, Alina, Juan commanded. She forced her eyes open, her vision blurred by tears of pure sensation. She saw Juan, his face tight with his own need, and Miho, his lips wet and glistening with her essence. Daeshim remained at her head, his hands now gripping her wrists, pinning them to the table above her head. You are ours, they whispered in that haunting, terrifyingly beautiful unison. I am yours, she sobbed, the words a vow. Claim me. Please, just claim me. Juan drove into her then, a powerful, deep thrust that hit the very back of her throat. Alina's eyes rolled back in her head. He was a force of nature, a solid, unyielding weight that filled every empty corner of her soul. He began to move, a slow, grinding pace that allowed her to feel every ridge of him. Miho didn't pull away. He stayed right there, his tongue still working on her clitoris, his hands now sliding under her buttocks to lift her higher, meeting Juan's every stroke. Daeshim leaned down again, his mouth at her ear. This is what it means to be loved by us, Alina. This is the protection we promised. No one gets to touch you but the men who would burn the world for you. The rhythm became faster, more desperate. The sound of their skin meeting, the ragged gasps for air, and the low, guttural growls of the brothers filled the kitchen. Alina was lost in a sea of gold and red, her body vibrating like a harp string. She felt the climax rushing toward her like a freight train, a tidal wave of sensation that promised to wash away everything she used to be. I'm close, she screamed, her fingers digging into Daeshim's forearms until she drew blood. Daeshim. Juan. Miho. No. Miho increased the pressure of his tongue. Juan delivered 3 final, devastatingly deep thrusts, and Daeshim bit down on the junction of her neck and shoulder, marking her as his in the moment of her release. Alina shattered. It wasn't just a climax, it was a transformation. Her body convulsed, wave after wave of white-hot pleasure crashing through her, leaving her breathless and shaking. She cried out their names, her voice echoing in the rafters, a sound of absolute surrender and absolute victory. The brothers followed her over the edge, their own releases synchronized and violent. Juan buried his face in her neck as his body went rigid, and Miho let out a low, triumphant sound as he finally pulled back, looking at the masterpiece of her pleasure. For a long time, the only sound in the room was the heavy, synchronized breathing of the four of them. The heat slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a soft, lingering warmth. Juan slowly withdrew, his body slipping away from hers with a reluctant friction. He reached down, picking up a discarded silk napkin and gently wiping the moisture from her thighs. Daesham released her wrists, his hands immediately softening as he stroked her hair. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, then each of her eyelids, and finally her lips. It was a kiss of profound tenderness, a sharp contrast to the fire of the moments before. "You are magnificent, little bird," Daesham whispered. Miho climbed onto the table beside her, kissing her cheek. A queen in her kitchen, and a goddess on her table. Juan stood by her side, his hand resting on her stomach. "You belong here, Alina. With us. Always." They stayed like that for a few minutes, a tangle of limbs and quiet hearts. But then, the real world began to knock. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed, and the sharp vibration of a cell phone on the counter broke the spell. Daesham was the first to straighten up, his expression shifting back into the mask of the powerful Mafia boss. He checked his watch, a small frown line appearing between his brows. "The board members are waiting in the satellite office. We've stayed away too long." Miho stood up, stretching his sore muscles. "And I have a shipment coming into the harbor at midnight that needs my personal signature. The authorities are being difficult again." Juan sighed, leaning down to give Alina one last, lingering kiss on the lips. "And I have to oversee the transfer of your former husband to his new permanent residence. I want to make sure the cell is as uncomfortable as I promised." They moved with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine, helping Alina off the table and wrapping her back in her silk robe. They didn't leave her coldly. They moved with a lingering, protective affection, but the shift in their energy was clear. The lovers had retreated, and the kings had returned. They walked her back to her suite, standing at the door like a three-man phalanx. "Get some rest, Alina," Daesham said, his hand lingering on the doorframe. "We have a busy day tomorrow. We'll be in meetings until late, but you are safe here. Our men are everywhere." "Good night, my love," Miho added, a playful glint returning to his eyes. "Don't dream of anyone but us," Juan warned with a wink. They turned as one, their footsteps heavy and purposeful on the marble floor as they headed toward their offices. Alina stood in the doorway, watching them go, her body still humming with the aftershocks of their touch. She closed the door and leaned against it, a small, triumphant smile on her face. Her husband had once told her she was nothing. Tonight, 3 kings had proven him wrong. She climbed into the large, empty bed, the scent of them still on her skin, and for the first time in her life, she fell into a deep and she had a scary nightmare. The moonlight cutting through the curtains felt like cold steel, but the dream was far colder. Alina saw a little girl, no older than 5, with curls that matched her own and eyes that held the shadow of her husband's cruelty. The child didn't smile. She pointed a skeletal finger toward the darkness. "Go back to him, Mama," the girl whispered, her voice a hollow wind. "If you stay here, they will ruin you. You belong in the cage. Go back, or you'll never see me again." Alina bolted upright, her lungs burning as she fought for air. The silence of the mansion felt like a trap. The grief she had suppressed about her lost pregnancy flared up, twisted by the nightmare into a frantic, irrational guilt. Her mind was a fractured mess of trauma. She felt a sudden, desperate need to see the man who had caused it all, not out of love, but out of a sick, deep-seated fear that the dream was right. She threw on her silk robe and raced downstairs, her bare feet slapping against the cold marble. 2 guards stood at the heavy mahogany doors, their faces impassive. "Take me to him," she gasped, clutching her throat. "The prison. Now." The guards exchanged a wary glance. "Miss Alina, the bosses are in a high-level meeting. We have strict orders to keep you inside." "Please," she sobbed, grabbing the lapels of the lead guard's jacket. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot with panic. "I just need to see him. 5 minutes. I can't breathe. If you don't take me, I'll jump from the balcony. Please. They don't have to know." The guards hesitated. They knew the triplets worshipped her, and seeing her in this state of mental collapse terrified them. "Fine," the older one whispered. "But if they find out, it's our heads." Not a word. They led her through the hidden stone path behind the estate to a low-slung, windowless concrete building. It was a place where sound died. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and iron. They stopped at a heavy steel door. Through the small reinforced glass, she saw him. Her husband was slumped in the corner of a cage, his designer clothes shredded and stained. He looked like a corpse that hadn't realized it was dead yet. When the guard buzzed the door open, he flinched, shielding his eyes from the dim light. "Alina," he croaked, his voice a dry rattle. He crawled toward her on his knees, his hands trembling. "Alina, thank God. You came for me. Please, tell them to let me go. I'll change. I'll be the man you want. Just have mercy." Alina turned to the guards, her face a mask of stone. "Leave us. I need to speak to him alone." "Miss, we can't." 5 minutes, she snapped, a flare of the Beck brothers' authority leaking into her tone. "I'm not leaving the cell until you give us the room." Reluctantly, they stepped back into the hallway, the heavy door clicking shut but not locking. Alina stood over the man who had been her son and her shadow. She stared at him, watching him weep at her feet. For a moment, she felt nothing. No hate, no love, just a cold, analytical observation of a fallen tyrant. He took her silence for weakness, for the old Alina who used to cave after every beating. "You still love me," he whispered, a spark of the old, manipulative fire returning to his eyes. "I knew it. Those monsters didn't change you." He stood up unsteadily, reaching out to cup her face with his grimy hands. "Kiss me, Alina. Tell me you're taking me home." He lunged forward, his cracked lips reaching for hers. Alina didn't flinch. She leaned back and delivered a slap so hard it echoed off the concrete walls. "You pathetic, disgusting dog," she hissed, her voice trembling with a decade of repressed rage. "I didn't come here to save you. I came to see if you were finally rotting. You killed my baby. You killed the woman I was. I hope you die in this hole." The husband's face transformed. The pleading mask melted away, revealing the monster underneath. "You think you're special now," he spat, his voice dropping into that terrifying, low register. "Because 3 gangsters are using you as a communal toy? You're still my property." He moved with a sudden, desperate violence, pinning her against the cold wall. His weight was a suffocating pressure she remembered too well. He fumbled with his trousers, his eyes manic. "I'll show you who owns you. I'll put another heir in you right here in the dirt." Alina fought back, her nails clawing at his face, her knee coming up to strike his groin. She wasn't the victim anymore. She was a fighter. But he was fueled by a cornered animal's rage. He grabbed her hair, jerking her head back, and delivered a brutal backhand that sent her spinning. "Stay down," he screamed, his fist connecting with her ribs. Alina fell, her head striking the edge of the metal cot. As she collapsed toward the floor, her shoulder slammed into a red plastic housing on the wall, the emergency silent alarm designed for the guards in case of a prisoner riot. In the main house, 3 phones buzzed simultaneously on a mahogany conference table. Daeshim, Juan, and Miho stopped mid-sentence. Their eyes met, and in a heartbeat, the atmosphere in the room turned lethal. They didn't speak, they moved. By the time the triplets burst into the prison corridor, the guards were already scrambling. Daeshim kicked the cell door so hard it nearly flew off its hinges. The scene inside was a nightmare. The husband was standing over Alina's crumpled form, his belt in his hand. Alina was motionless on the floor, her robe splayed open, a dark bruise already forming on her temple. Juan didn't wait. He was a blur of charcoal wool and raw fury. He caught the husband mid-swing, his fist connecting with the man's jaw with a sound like a breaking branch. He didn't stop there. He dragged him into the center of the room, his movements methodical and terrifyingly violent. Miho and Daeshim were on the floor instantly, pulling Alina into their arms. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow and ragged. "Alina," Daeshim choked out, his voice cracking for the first time in his life. He pulled her against his chest, his hands shaking as he checked for a pulse. "Wake up, little bird. Please, wake up." Miho looked up at the guards, his eyes glowing with a murderous light. If she doesn't wake up, he whispered, his voice a promise of genocide, none of you will live to see the sunrise. Juan let out a guttural roar, throwing the husband against the bars. You touched her again, he hissed, his hands tightening around the man's throat. I'm not going to kill you today. That would be too kind. I'm going to make you wish you had never been born. Alina remained limp in Daesham's arms, the silence of the cell broken only by the sound of the husband's desperate gasps and the frantic beating of 3 hearts that had finally found something to lose. When Alina finally woke up, the first thing Alina heard wasn't the harsh, rattling breath of her husband or the heavy thud of a fist against concrete. It was a low, melodic drone of a voice, professional and calm, speaking in hushed Korean. The smell of antiseptic was faint, overridden by the familiar, grounding scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco that permeated the Beck estate. She has suffered a mild concussion and significant soft tissue bruising, the doctor was saying. But the trauma is as much psychological as it is physical. Her body is in a state of high alert. She needs rest, yes, but she also needs human touch that doesn't carry a threat. Regular, gentle body massages will help stimulate blood flow to the bruised areas and, more importantly, lower her cortisol levels. She needs to feel that her skin is a place of safety again, not a battlefield. Alina slowly cracked her eyes open. The ceiling wasn't the stained, cracked plaster of the prison cell or the sterile tiles of the public hospital. It was the deep, coffered oak of the master's suite, the room where she had first felt the world shift under the weight of the brothers' devotion. Alina. The voice was a frantic caress. Miho was at her side in an instant, his face a map of exhaustion and raw relief. He didn't wait for her to speak. He leaned over and pressed a lingering, desperate kiss to her forehead, his lips trembling against her skin. You're back, he whispered, his eyes searching hers. Don't ever do that again. My heart stopped in that hallway. Alina tried to sit up, a sharp wince escaping her as her ribs protested the movement. I'm sorry. I thought you would be angry. I went behind your back. I saw him. She waited for the blow, or at least the cold, sharp tongue lashing she would have received from her husband for such disobedience. Instead, Daesham stepped into her line of sight, his expression uncharacteristically soft. He sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand, his thumb tracing the back of her knuckles. We aren't angry, Alina. We are devastated that you felt you had to go alone. We understand that a decade of chains doesn't fall off just because the lock is broken. Trauma has a long tail. You needed to face the ghost to see if it still had teeth. He bit me, she whispered, a tear escaping and sliding into her hair. The dream said I belonged to him. The dream was a lie told by a dying demon, Juan growled from the corner of the room. He was leaning against the wall, his knuckles bruised and swollen, a silent testament to what he had done to the man in the cell. He will never speak to you again. We've moved him to a facility where even the shadows don't talk. A therapist will be here this evening. She specializes in women who have escaped, men like him. She will help you untangle the nightmares. They stayed with her for hours, alternating who held her hand and who brought her water. There was no judgment, no, I told you so. They simply existed around her as a fortress. By the late afternoon, the house had settled into a quiet hum. The therapist had gone, leaving Alina with a heavy heart but a clearer head. The doctor's orders for a massage remained, and Miho had volunteered with a fierce, protective insistence. The room was bathed in the orange glow of a setting sun. Miho had drawn the heavy curtains, leaving only enough light to see the curves of her body. He had warmed a bottle of organic oil infused with lavender and ginger. Lie down, little bird, he murmured. Alina let her robe fall to the floor. She was completely naked, her skin mapped with the fading yellow of old bruises and the angry purple of the new ones. She felt a flicker of shame, but Miho's gaze held no disgust, only a terrifyingly deep reverence. He helped her onto the stomach-down position, draping a soft silk sheet over her lower half, though he soon folded it back to work on her legs. He poured the warm oil into his palms, rubbing them together to create heat. When he first touched her back, Alina flinched, her muscles locking in anticipation of pain. Breathe, Alina, Miho whispered, his voice a low vibration near her ear. It's just me. I'm not here to take. I'm here to give back what was stolen. He started at the base of her neck, his thumbs moving in slow, deliberate circles. He was incredibly strong, but he tempered his power with a delicacy that made her breath hitch. He worked the knots out of her shoulders, moving down the long line of her spine. With every stroke, the tension that had been coiled in her marrow since the nightmare began to unravel. He spent a long time on her mid-back, avoiding the direct sights of her bruises, but working the surrounding muscles that had gone rigid to protect her ribs. The heat from his hands seeped into her skin, melting the ice in her veins. "You have such a beautiful back," Miho remarked, his voice thick with emotion. "Like a bow that has been bent too far but refused to break. I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to tension yourself like this again." He moved to her lower body, his hands sliding over the flare of her hips. The massage was therapeutic, but as the pain receded, a different kind of sensation began to take its place. The sliding of his oiled palms against her skin was intoxicating. Alina found herself moaning, not from pain, but from the sheer, overwhelming luxury of being touched with such care. Miho noticed the change in her breathing. He shifted his position, straddling her thighs without putting his full weight on her. He leaned down, his chest brushing her back, his hands moving to the outsides of her fronts, kneading the tissue with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. "Is this okay?" he rasped. "Yes," she gasped, her face buried in the silk pillow. "Please, don't stop." He turned her over gently, his eyes taking in the full sight of her. He took more oil and began to work on her stomach, his touch featherlight around the area where her baby had once been. It was a healing touch, a silent apology for the world's cruelty. As he moved lower, his hands sliding over her inner thighs, the air in the room grew heavy. The massage was no longer just about blood flow, it was about reclamation. He was marking every inch of her with his scent and his warmth, drowning out the memory of the husband's violent grip. "I want you to forget his touch," Miho whispered, his fingers venturing near the damp curls between her legs. "I want your skin to only remember the Beck brothers. I want you to feel so loved that the fear has no room to grow back." He began to use the oil on her most sensitive parts, his touch slow and agonizingly sweet. It wasn't the frantic hunger of the threesome or the raw power of Juan, it was a slow burn devotion. He watched her face as she drifted on a sea of sensation, her eyes fluttering, her lips parted. "Miho," she whispered, reaching up to pull him down to her. He met her lips in a kiss that tasted of lavender and heat. As they moved together on the bed, the massage transitioned into a slow, intense lovemaking that felt like a prayer. He moved inside her with a steady, grounding rhythm, his eyes never leaving hers. Every thrust was a word, a promise of a future where she was the queen of their hearts. By the time he collapsed beside her, both of them slick with oil and sweat, the room was dark. Alina felt heavy, her body humming with a deep, structural peace. The nightmare of the little girl had faded, replaced by the reality of the man holding her. Miho's hands, still glistening with the aromatic lavender oil, slid beneath her lower back, lifting her hips to meet his steady, deliberate pace. The friction of his skin against hers was no longer just a physical sensation, it was a rhythmic purging of every dark memory that had ever taken root in her body. Each time he pushed deep inside her, she felt a wave of warmth radiating through her core, a sharp contrast to the cold, clinical violence she had known for a decade. This wasn't the frantic, hollow act she had endured as a wife, this was a communion. His eyes remained locked on hers, dark and swirling with a fierce, protective light. He watched the way her pupils dilated with every slow, stretching stroke, the way her lips parted to let out a breathy, melodic moan that sounded like a woman finding her voice for the first time. Miho reached down between their joined bodies, his thumb finding her clitoris and circling it with a heavy, oiled pressure. The double sensation of his fullness inside her and his expert touch outside sent a jolt of pure, golden electricity through her nervous system. "You feel that, Alina?" he rasped, his voice vibrating in his chest against her own. "That's the only truth you need to know. You aren't a victim. You aren't broken. You are a goddess being worshipped." Alina arched her back, her fingers digging into the muscles of his forearms. The pleasure was so intense it felt structural, as if he were reassembling her soul with every movement. The walls of her hole pulsed around him, tight and slick, clenching with a desperate, hungry gratitude. She felt the heavy, thudding beat of his heart against her ribs, and, for the first time, she didn't want to run. She wanted to disappear into the heat of him. "Miho," she choked out, her head tossing back against the pillows. It's better than any medicine. I don't want to talk to a stranger about my pain. I don't want to sit in a chair and unravel my life for someone who studied psychology. They don't know the weight of his hands. They don't know the sound of the locks." Miho slowed his pace even more, his movements becoming agonizingly shallow before he buried himself to the hilt again, his eyes never wavering. He moved his hand lower, his fingers slick with the oil and her own natural arousal, and began to stroke her hole with a slow, hypnotic rhythm that made her vision blur. "You are the therapy I need," she whispered, her voice cracking with raw emotion. The way you touch me, the way you look at me as if I'm precious, this is the only thing that heals the scars. You and your brothers. You're the only ones who can reach the places that were hurt." Miho let out a low, guttural sound, a mix of a growl and a sob. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, his breath hot and ragged. "Then I will be your doctor, your priest, and your king, Alina. If this is what heals you, then I will never stop. I will spend every night until the end of time showing you that your body is a temple, not a cage." He began to increase the tempo, the therapeutic softness giving way to a more primal, urgent need. The sounds of their bodies meeting the wet, rhythmic slap of skin and the low groans of pleasure filled the quiet room. Alina felt her climax building, a tidal wave of white-hot light that promised to drown out the last lingering echoes of the nightmare. She wrapped her legs around his waist, pulling him deeper, demanding every inch of him. She wanted him to break through the final barriers of her fear, to occupy every space her husband had tried to destroy. The pleasure was overwhelming, a beautiful, searing agony that made her heart hammer against her ribs. "I'm here, Alina," Miho whispered, his hand moving to the back of her head, anchoring her to the present. "Stay with me. Don't go back to the dark. Stay in the light." With one final, devastatingly deep thrust, Alina shattered. It was a violent, beautiful release that rippled through her entire body, making her muscles twitch and her voice rise in a long, high-pitched cry of surrender. She felt the tension of years, the fear, the grief, the shame simply evaporate into the air. Miho followed her moments later, his body stiffening as he poured himself into her, a deep, primal roar escaping his throat. He held her tightly, his arms a fortress around her, as they both drifted on the aftershocks of the explosion. As the silence returned to the room, Alina lay beneath him, her heart slowing to a peaceful rhythm. She felt heavy and well-used, but for the first time, she felt clean. The lavender oil and the scent of Miho were the only things that remained on her skin. She reached up, tracing the line of his jaw, her eyes shining with a new, quiet strength. "Thank you," she breathed. Miho kissed her deeply, a slow, sweet seal on the night's work. "You don't thank a man for breathing, Alina. And you're the air in this house. Get some rest. We have a long life ahead of us, and I plan on spending every second of it proving that you are ours to protect, love, and worship." The heavy silence that followed their lovemaking was the first true peace Alina had known in years. Miho didn't pull away, he stayed joined with her, his weight a grounding comfort rather than a burden. He continued to stroke her hair, his fingers gentle as they moved through her curls, while his other hand remained low, his thumb tracing the sensitive, swollen heat of her entrance with that same hypnotic, oiled rhythm. "You're vibrating," Miho whispered, his voice vibrating against her neck. "It's the first time my body doesn't feel like it's waiting for a blow," Alina admitted, her voice thick with the afterglow. "Every time he touched me, my muscles would lock. I didn't even realize I was doing it until now. But with you, I feel like I'm melting. I feel like I'm finally taking up space in my own skin." Miho's grip tightened slightly, a possessive but tender anchor. "That is the only way you will ever feel again. We will make sure of it. If you need 1,000 massages, 1,000 nights like this to wash him out of your marrow, then that is what you will have." He began to move again, but it wasn't for his own release. He moved with a slow, agonizingly deep slide, feeling the way she stretched and accommodated him. He wanted her to feel every ridge, every pulse of his desire, to replace the memory of cold violence with the reality of hot, dedicated passion. Alina gasped, her fingers digging into the silk of the headboard. The sensation was therapeutic in its intensity, a deep tissue massage for her very soul. "Tell me what you feel, Alina," Miho commanded softly, his lips grazing her earlobe. "Tell me what his memory feels like right now." "It feels like smoke," she whispered, her eyes fluttering closed as she focused on the internal friction. "Like something distant and gray. But you're fire. You're solid. When you move inside me, it's like you're cauterizing the wounds. You're filling the holes he left behind." She moved her hips in a small, tentative circle, experimenting with her own power. For years, she had been a passive recipient of pain, but here, in the amber glow of the Beck estate, she was allowed to be a participant in her own pleasure. She felt the slickness of the lavender oil acting as a lubricant between their chests, making every breath a sliding, sensual event. Miho groaned, his pace quickening just a fraction as he felt her response. He reached down, his fingers finding the sensitive bundle of nerves at her core again. He worked them with a deliberate, slow-motion intensity that made Alina's world narrow down to a single point of light. She felt the muscles of her whole clenching around him in rhythmic waves, a physical manifestation of her healing. "This is the only therapy that matters," she murmured, her head tossing from side to side. "The way you hold my gaze, the way you don't look away when I cry. A doctor would ask me how I feel. You make me feel. You force me to stay in the present, in this bed, in this moment." Miho leaned up on his elbows, looking down at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated worship. He took her hands and pinned them gently above her head, not to restrain her, but to open her completely to his gaze. He began to thrust with a powerful, grounding depth, each impact a silent vow. "Then let me heal you, Alina," he rasped. "Let me be the medicine that never runs out. Every time you feel that darkness creeping back, come to us. Come to me. We will fuck the fear out of you until there is nothing left but light." The lovemaking transitioned into something even more intense, a slow burn crescendo that seemed to last an eternity. Alina felt her body becoming a vessel for his strength. The pleasure wasn't just a physical peak, it was a spiritual cleansing. She felt the last of the tension in her jaw, her shoulders, and her womb finally dissolve. She was being reparented by desire, shown that she was worthy of a touch that sought only to cherish. As she reached her second climax, it was quieter than the first, but deeper. It was a long, slow shudder that started in her toes and radiated upward, leaving her feeling hollowed out and renewed. She wept, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being known and still being loved. Miho stayed with her through the tears, his kisses catching every drop. He didn't ask her to stop, he simply held her until the storm passed. When he finally withdrew, he did so with a lingering slowness, as if he hated to lose the connection. He pulled the silk sheet over them both and tucked her head into the crook of his shoulder. "The world is quiet now, Alina," he whispered into the darkness. "And it's going to stay that way. Tomorrow, we start the rest of your life. But tonight you just belong to me." Alina didn't answer with words. She simply pressed her face into his chest, listening to the steady, powerful thud of his heart, the only clock she ever wanted to follow again. The lavender scent lingered in the air, a fragrant shield against the ghosts of the past, and for the first time in 10 years, she fell asleep without checking the lock on the door. The sun hadn't even fully cleared the horizon when the heavy, rhythmic pounding on the master's suite door shattered the silence. Alina was pulled from a deep, lavender-scented sleep, her body still heavy with the languid warmth of Miho's touch from the night before. Beside her, Miho was already upright, his eyes snapping from soft affection to a cold, predatory sharpness in a fraction of a second. From the hallway, the panicked voice of a lead security officer cut through the air. "Boss, it's the prisoner. He's gone." The medical transport was intercepted, and the facility was breached from the inside. The air in the room instantly curdled. Alina felt a familiar, icy dread crawl up her spine, a physical sensation of a shadow falling over her heart. She sat up, clutching the silk sheets to her chest as the door swung open. Daeshim and Juan were already there, dressed in their dark suits, looking less like men and more like monuments of impending violence. Gone. Juan's voice was a low, vibrating hiss that made the glass of the bedside lamp rattle. He stepped toward the trembling guard, his hands clenching into white-knuckled fists. You had one job. To keep that parasitic dog in a cage until he rotted. And you let him slip through your fingers. We think he had outside help, sir. A sleeper cell from his old associates. I don't care about his associates. Juan roared, slamming his hand against the doorframe. The sound was like a gunshot. If that man is not back in a cell within the hour, I will personally ensure that your families are the ones filling the vacancies in our graveyard. Do you understand me? I want his corpse dragged across this driveway, or I want his living body broken at my feet so I can finish what I started. Alina scrambled out of bed, her robe fluttering behind her as she rushed toward the three brothers. Her legs felt weak, the therapeutic peace of the previous night evaporating like mist in a furnace. What's happening? Did he escape? Where is he? They didn't look at her. It was as if a glass wall had been erected between her and the men who had worshipped her only hours ago. Their focus was entirely on the logistics of war. Mijo, get the satellite tracking on his last known vehicle, Daesham commanded, his voice a freezing wind. Juan, take the southern teams. Block every port. If a single boat leaves Incheon without being searched, kill the captain. Wait. Alina cried, reaching out to grab Daesham's arm. Her fingers brushed the expensive wool of his jacket, but he didn't turn. Please talk to me. Is he coming here? Is he coming for me? He isn't coming anywhere, Juan snapped, checking the magazine of a sleek, black handgun with a clinical click-clack that made Alina flinch. He's going to the ground. Permanently. No. Alina's voice rose, a sharp, jagged sound in the opulent hallway. I don't want more blood. I just wanted the divorce. I wanted him away from me, not murdered. If you kill him, this never ends. I wanted peace, Daesham. I didn't ask for a dead ex-husband. The brothers moved in a synchronized, chilling silence, stepping past her as if she were a ghost. They were barking orders into their phones, their faces etched in a terrifying, mask-like ruthlessness that she had only heard stories about. The tenderness, the soft massages, the whispered vows of love, all of it had been shelved, replaced by the ancient, bloody laws of the Mafia. Listen to me, she begged, tears starting to blur her vision as she followed them down the stairs. Don't do this. Please. Mijo, the one who had held her so gently through the night, didn't even glance back as he adjusted his holster. Stay in your room, Alina. The guards will lock the wing. Don't come out until we tell you it's over. It's never over if you kill him, she sobbed, standing at the top of the grand staircase as they reached the foyer. The heavy front doors were thrown open, revealing a phalanx of black cars and armed men waiting in the dawn light. She collapsed onto the top step, the cold marble biting into her skin. The tears were a flood now, hot and bitter. She had escaped a monster only to be championed by three others who were now revealing the true, terrifying scale of their power. She watched their silhouettes disappear into the line of cars, the engines roaring to life like a pack of hungry beasts. I just wanted to be free, she whispered into the empty, echoing hall, her voice breaking. I didn't want to be the reason people die. But the only answer she received was the screech of tires and the heavy, final thud of the front doors being locked from the outside. Besties, get ready. Part 2 is coming soon. The stakes are higher than ever. You won't want to miss the shocking twists coming in the next series. Hit the subscribe button and see you there.